heavily dependent on imports. So if it left the euro and then created a, let's call it the new drachma, that would be a massively devalued currency, and those imports would become even more expensive. So the problem, I think, is that there are no good options for Greece at the moment. People realise that whatever way they choose, it's going to be extremely painful.
OK, Chris Morris in Athens, thank you very much. Well, Sally is here, and the reason why this matters is that if they default, it does affect everybody. I mean, one question that I keep wondering is, how secure are the banks? How much have they, cautioned against this? Because this has been building now for months.
Well, they're not secure at all. In fact, you've got Moody's, the ratings agency, actually looking at France's banks at the moment, because France is the most heavily exposed to Greece. It's exposed by around about just a touch under $60 billion. Essentially, it's looking at what France is exposed to and suggesting that it might have to downgrade some of France's major banks. And of course, if that happens, then that has a much more of a knock-on effect as well. We've got a report out today from Ernst & Young, which essentially says that if the Greek crisis is not solved in what it calls an orderly way, then we are likely to see not just not very much growth, but certainly the whole of the Eurozone going back into recession. And the real doomsayers say that if it's not resolved in an orderly way, then we're likely to see another financial crisis, almost a global financial crisis on the scale of Lehman Brothers as well.
To the streets to protest against austerity cuts. Crowds gathered in Syntagmus Square outside Parliament, furious at government plans to make billions of euros of savings through belt tightening and through the sale of state assets. Meanwhile, though, the rest of the Eurozone is pressing hard for Greek politicians to sign off on those cuts. A meeting of European finance ministers dragged on into the early hours of Monday morning, but they still haven't signed off on the next instalment of Greek rescue loans. France 24's Brussels correspondent Frédéric Simon gave us more details.
EU finance ministers refused at their meeting to release the next tranche of loans for Greece worth 12 billion euros, a sum that was expected to keep Athens afloat until September. They said this new tranche of aid would be released, but only once painful austerity reforms are being passed in the Greek parliament. Now, if this is not done on time, Greece could in fact default on its debt as early as mid-July. So this is a very serious warning launched yesterday by the finance ministers in Luxembourg.
Well, meanwhile, Frederic, there's already a second massive bailout plan for Greece in the works. When could the government there see that money?
Well, this is linked, of course, to the second bailout, which is for the longer term, and their finance ministers backed in principle the second bailout package for Greece, which would be around 120 billion euros that Athens will need, in fact, in order to pay back its bill up until 2014. Now, half of the sum is expected to come from the EU and IMF, roughly 60 billion euros, and the rest would come from a sell-off of state firms by Athens and the new package of austerity measures. But the disagreement between Europeans over the participation of the private sector has led the finance ministers yesterday to postpone their approval of this second bailout until their next meeting on 11 July. The subject will also be on the table of the meeting of EU leaders this coming Thursday and Friday.
Well, mass protests also continued elsewhere in Europe on Sunday. More than 100,000 people hit the streets in Spain to demonstrate over the handling of Europe's economic crisis. The movement has become known as Los Indignados, the indignant, and Sunday's rally is mainly focused on the Euro Pact, a deal agreed by Eurozone members to stimulate competitiveness by giving companies greater power to hire and fire.
Of July before granting another rescue package. Until then, there's to be no handout of cash. Now, Greece, of course, was the first Eurozone country to receive a financial bailout that happened in May last year. That $157 billion was meant to last 3 years, but the recession is getting worse. The next installment of $17 billion will be released in July, but only if strict cuts are made. Prime Minister George Papandreou, though, can't do that until he survives a no-confidence vote, which is scheduled for 21 GMT on Tuesday. Also under discussion was a second bailout, this time worth close to $171 billion. Jonah Hull has more now from Luxembourg.
once again have a very big problem, the Greek debt crisis that they thought they'd fixed a year ago with a very big bailout.
I have decided to hold an extra meeting of the Eurogroup for Sunday the 3rd of July, which presupposes that between now and then the Greek authorities, both government and parliamentary, will have done all they can to allow us to take our decisions on a solid basis.
They've decided to hold back the latest $17 billion slice of that bailout until Greece approves a fresh set of reforms and privatisations. It's a hollow challenge delivered with fingers crossed. Eurozone finance ministers are faced with a dilemma. It's clear Greece is sucking up good money after bad. For all the billions, its problems only seem to be getting bigger. But it's also clear that a Greek default would be far worse for the Euro club than it would be for Greece itself. To prevent it requires far more money for far longer. The existing bailout is fast becoming a sideshow. It's just not working. Opposition on the streets of Greece and political discord have sent borrowing rates soaring. So the discussions now are of a brand new bailout, billions more thrown at the problem.
We also made progress on the discussion on the content and conditions of a next step for Greece and the nature of private sector involvement.
Negotiators will try to encourage private investors, the big banks that hold Greek debt, to shoulder some of the burden. A Greek default, after all, could trigger another global banking crisis. In the end, though, the financial markets will decide. If the economy recovers, in time they might offer Greece affordable borrowing again. But the fear is they'll decide instead that Greece is beyond help, forcing a default, and so too others like Ireland and Portugal, maybe even Spain, putting in question the future of the Eurozone as a whole.
Well, we can speak to Jonah live now. He is in Luxembourg for us. I mean, Jonah, it's quite interesting. On the one hand, the EU is playing tough with Greece, withholding the money for a while, saying the cuts need to be implemented. But obviously, it's in the Eurozone's interest for Greece to do well. So is it a bit of a bluff?
There is a bit of a sense of that. The Eurozone doesn't really have too many cards to play here. It would be far worse for them if Greece were to default than for Greece itself. So there's a sense that this is a signal to Greece to try and get them into line. It's also a signal to the financial markets that the matter is being taken into hand. Look, I think that behind the scenes there is real concern in the Eurozone about the way all of this is unfolding. It's abundantly clear that the existing arrangements, the bailout, is not having the desired effect. Greece has been missing austerity and budgetary targets amid violent opposition on the streets and in Parliament, all of which has spooked the financial markets and sent borrowing costs ever higher. And all the while now the word contagion more and more in the air, that worry that Greece's problems will shift on to other economies in the so-called periphery of Europe. Let me read you a statement released by the IMF on Monday into the state of Euro economies. Failure, it says, to undertake decisive action could rapidly spread tensions to the core of the euro area and result in large global spillovers. So concerns more widely than the Eurozone alone. And here's the big problem, the biggest worry, that even a second bailout, which is under discussion now, may not go far enough to allow Greece to stand on its own 2 feet by 2014 as it will envisage, which is why many people are warning that the Eurozone is simply storing up problems here for the future, that a default for Greece is an inevitability and possibly for other countries as well, with disastrous consequences for the global economy.
Jonah Hull with the latest there from Luxembourg. Thank you. Well, meanwhile, the Greek Prime Minister, George Papandreou, was in bullish mood in Belgium as he urged Europe to help his debt-laden nation.
I'd like to say that we are determined as a country and as a government to be on track with the program, to move forward, to do what is necessary in order to put our country into a fiscally much better and viable position. We have been doing this over the past year and will continue to do so. And I do hope that the Greek Parliament will be approving the program which we have in front of us.
The Greek Prime Minister there. Meanwhile, back at home, Greece is facing possible power cuts as workers at its main energy suppliers strike in protest at privatization plans. The employees' union says the 48-hour strike will continue into a series of rolling strikes. Greece wants to sell a 17% stake in the energy company to help cut its deficit. The unions are worried about job losses and the rise in electricity prices. Well, unsurprisingly, the current economic climate is hitting Greek businesses hard. 70,000 were forced to cease trading last year, and a further 120,000 are expected to close by next year. Our correspondent Tim Friend went to meet Konstantinos Mikalos, the head of the Athens Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
We are in a fairly affluent part of Athens, but nevertheless, there have been closures here. There's some incredible statistic, I think, that says in an average Greek high street, a third of all businesses are in trouble.
We're, as you say, in the most affluent area in Athens in terms of shopping, in terms of retail. And unfortunately, this is the case where we've got over 30% of the shops in this area closed down.
Real hardship, in other words.
Absolutely. We have an example. One of the stores, a retail chain here, which was very popular. Unfortunately, 3 months ago, although it was selling well-known products at extremely good prices, they still ended up with rolling down.
Bailout, but still austerity. You're at the sharp end. You represent businesses, business people. You want growth.
Absolutely.
How are you going to get that?
Well, we've said on every occasion that you can't keep on milking a cow without feeding it. And what we need to stimulate the economy. We need to enhance growth measures. And there is one way, and this is that the 20 billion that has been allocated by the European Union in terms of the European Structural Fund for Greece to be allocated immediately rather than waiting for the national contribution.
Well, that's very interesting, and it's quite graphic here with all these closures. I think here's another one. But if you've got that kind of deal you've just been mentioning, do you think it could be done? You could get growth back into the economy?
Yes, we could start to have growth back simply because at the moment the major problem that the Greek economy is facing is the so-called liquidity crunch. Now, at the moment we have excellent business plans and propositions put forward to banks who recognize their excellent plans, but simply they don't have enough funds in order to finance these plans. So if we do have this assistance that will come from the European Union, it would be a start.
Tim Friend, they're speaking to Konstantinos Mikalos, the head of the Athens Chamber of Commerce. Well, that's it from Europe for the moment.
Ministers and the IMF saying it must bring in new austerity measures before it can receive any more emergency help to help pay off its debts. At stake are $17 billion, part of a deal agreed last year, and a second bailout package likely to be worth around $160 billion. The Greek Prime Minister will face a confidence vote in his government on Tuesday and a vote on restructuring on Sunday. The IMF is going to visit the country this week, but its acting chief says he expects the measures to go ahead.
You ask what would happen if all things went wrong. We're concentrated on making sure they go right. And our focus is absolutely on completing the conditions necessary to move the existing program forward. We have what we have viewed as a very credible commitment by the Greek authorities. I think you may have seen the new Minister of Finance has issued a statement, I believe recently, underscoring their commitment